There are some stories out there that are just so wild. They feel more like myth than history. It's a tale about a journey to the absolute end of the world, about a ship swallowed whole by ice, and about a leader who just refused to let hope die. This is the story of the Endurance, a journey of survival against truly impossible odds. Let's get into it.
So where does a story like this even begin? Well, it starts with what has to be the most brutally honest job ad ever written. Sir Ernest Shackleton put this in the newspaper for his Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. And the goal? Oh, just to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. No big deal. And despite the honesty, or maybe because of it, over 5,000 men applied.
And out of those thousands of hopefuls, Shackleton handpicked a crew of 28 for his ship, the Endurance. These guys weren't just sailors and scientists, they were adventurers, every one of them, all united by this dream of conquering the last great frontier on Earth. For them, this ship, it was everything. Their lifeline, their home, their hope.
Now here's where things get really interesting, especially when you look at the legend around the ship itself. It's often called the strongest wooden ship ever built. But the reality? Well, it's a bit more complicated. The Endurance was actually designed for tourism in the Arctic, which has very different ice than the immense crushing power of the Antarctic. And the crazy part, the thing history sometimes glosses over, is that Shackleton himself knew his ship wasn't really built for this. He was taking a calculated and absolutely massive risk right from the get-go.
And well, that risk caught up with them, and fast. On January 18, 1915, before they'd even reached the continent, the Endurance was grabbed by the frozen Weddell Sea. What they hoped was just a temporary delay quickly became a slow, silent drift into the complete unknown. They were trapped.
And this is where you really start to see the genius of Shackleton as a leader. He didn't fixate on the ship, he focused on his men. He knew their greatest enemy wasn't going to be the cold, but the soul-crushing weight of despair. So, what was his first priority? Maintain morale, no matter what.
So, to fight off that despair, life on the ice became this routine of structured fun and hard work. Psychologically, this was absolutely brilliant, right? The routine gave them a sense of purpose and control when they had none. I'm talking full-on football matches on the ice, building these ingenious dog-loos for their sled dogs, and holding rowdy sing-alongs. Their 1914 Christmas dinner was an actual feast of turtle soup and Christmas pudding. In the most desolate place on Earth, they literally built a community.
But the ice. The ice was just this relentless, patient predator. After 10 long months of drifting, the immense pressure of the surrounding floes began to exert its final, terrifying force. The little community they had built was about to be shattered.
On October 24th, the sounds started. The cracking of massive timbers echoed like gunfire through the Antarctic silence. Imagine hearing this. As Captain Frank Worsley wrote, they could hear beams and timbers groaning and cracking all around us like pistol shots. They were literally listening to their ship die. The forces at play here were just unimaginable. The ice wasn't just squeezing the ship, it was bending it into this unnatural, broken shape. Massive deck beams buckled, windows splintered. And all the crew could do was watch, totally helpless, as their home was torn apart. Then, on October 27th, it happened, the fatal blow. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNeish, he delivered the grim news. The ice had finally punched through the hull. Water was pouring in, the fight was over. Shackleton gave the one order he never, ever wanted to give: abandon ship.
So what actually happened? Well, the diaries tell a story of just total structural collapse. Tearing off the rudder, that was just a beginning. The real point of no return came when the keel, the ship's very spine, was ripped away. The carpenter McNish wrote that the ship was broken in two halves, and after that, it was just a cascade of failure. Internal beams collapsed, and the ice simply punched right through the sides. In Shackleton's own words, it was total annihilation. So now, these 28 men were castaways. Not on some tropical island, no, but on a vast, unstable sheet of moving ice hundreds of miles from land in the most hostile environment on the entire planet. Their journey was far from over. In a lot of ways, it had only just begun. And just look at these dates for a second. Really let this sink in. From getting trapped in January 1915 to finally reaching land in April 1916, that's 497 days. Think about that. Nearly a year and a half spent drifting on ice and fighting the seas in open boats before they even set foot on solid ground again.
That first piece of land was Elephant Island, and trust me, it was no paradise. It was a desolate, unforgiving shard of rock and ice. There, with remarkable ingenuity, they built a shelter by turning 2 of their lifeboats upside down. For 4 long months, 22 men huddled inside this tiny space, surviving on a pretty grim diet of whatever they could hunt, seals and penguins.
But Elephant Island wasn't a rescue. It was a prison. Nobody in the entire world knew they were there. And as the brutal Antarctic winter started to close in, Shackleton realized that waiting meant certain death. He made this desperate, almost you'd have to call it a suicidal decision. He was going to take a small team and sail for help.
But he couldn't take everyone, right? The boat was just too small, the journey way too perilous. So he chose just 5 of his absolute toughest men to go with him. The other 22, they would have to wait behind on that frozen rock, huddled under their overturned boats, just praying this monumental gamble would pay off.
And their vessel? Well, you couldn't even call it a ship. It was one of the lifeboats they'd salvaged, the James Caird. It was just a little over 22 feet long. This tiny, open boat, barely patched up from the wreck, and with its sides built up with scavenged junk, was about to go up against the roughest, most violent seas on the entire planet.
And their destination? A tiny whaling station on South Georgia Island, 800 treacherous miles away. To get there, they had to cross the infamous Drake Passage, an ocean of constant hurricane-force winds and monstrous waves that sailors called graybeards, some of them towering over 60 feet high that could swallow their little boat in an instant.
And against every single odd, they made it. The success of this whole impossible journey really came down to the superlative skills of one man, Captain Frank Worsley. Navigating with only a sextant and a chronometer, through blinding sea spray and storm clouds, he somehow managed to find a tiny island in a vast, violent ocean. After 17 days, they landed on South Georgia. This miracle of navigation was the key. It was the act that guaranteed that eventually all 28 men would be rescued. In the end, not a single life was lost. Not one.
So, if you think about it, the expedition was, by its original objective, a complete and total failure. They never crossed Antarctica, but it became something so much bigger. One of history's most powerful stories of leadership and resilience. You know, the ship's name was taken from the Shackleton family motto, "By endurance, we conquer."
So what can we learn from this? Well, Shackleton's leadership offers some timeless lessons. He understood that optimism wasn't just some fluffy feeling. It was a vital survival tool. He led from the front, never asking his men to endure a hardship he wouldn't face himself. And maybe most important of all, when the original goal became impossible, he had the wisdom to create a new one, a far more important one. Bring every single man home alive. He simply refused to give up.
And believe it or not, the story has this one last incredible chapter. For 107 years, the Endurance lay lost at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. Then, in March of 2022, an expedition using these amazing state-of-the-art underwater drones, they finally found it. Resting nearly 10,000 feet down, it's perfectly preserved in the frigid, dark water, a silent monument to its doomed voyage.
So the ship itself was lost to the ice, but the story of the crew, that was never lost. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? In a world of fleeting moments, what is it that gives a story the power to truly last forever? What makes it endure?